want to talk about the susceptibility factor a little bit. There were native populations that were known to have harbored polioviruses of all 3 strains and to have no poliomyelitis whatsoever. There are several examples of this throughout the globe, but this was my favorite one. And this was a paper that was published in 1964. It's some 90-odd pages long. And this Dr. Neal went down to the Brazilian rainforest and found this Javante tribe. And they had isolated themselves from the white population for a very long time because they learned very quickly that when they interfaced, there was a lot of disease happening with them. However, they did have measles, they did have polio, they had influenza, they had salmonella, they had all the same diseases that we had, but the diseases not only weren't spreading as rapidly through their population, but they weren't dying from it, and they weren't having any poliomyelitis. When they did a random sample of blood and fecal tests on these natives, they found that they were 100% immune to all 3 types of poliovirus, and there was no disease whatsoever. So this makes us wonder what the added circumstances are in paralysis that we saw happening as there was continued industrialization. So I want to talk about synergy a little bit. These are added circumstances that either alone or in combination with viruses can make them more virulent. Well, synergy basically means that when 2 separate forces come together, that they accomplish more together than either one would have alone. Kind of like pre-existing malnutrition resulting in potentially more devastating vaccine damage, which we know is true. Well, this is the short list of synergistic entities that transformed polio from a benign inhabitant into a terrorist in a select few. The first one is injections, including antibiotics and vaccines. And this is termed provocation polio. And this isn't an occult secret concept. This is, you can Google this, you can go onto PubMed, and you can find dozens of articles about it. It was widely known that any type of intramuscular injection could precipitate poliomyelitis, but especially one with toxic chemicals and irritants. The theory on the process by which this happens was as follows. I explained the pathogenesis theory of polio infection, but that phase when the poliovirus goes bloodborne, that there's any interruption in the tissue or breakage of the blood vessels by a needle, for instance, that poliovirus could have access into peripheral nerves and make its way into the central nervous system. Commonly, though not always, paralysis affects the injected limb when this happens. We need help. Thanks. I think the pharmaceutical company sent a drone to do that. That was good. It was Mark. I know it's upsetting, but try not to break anything. There are numerous well-accepted reports in conventional medical literature on provocation polio that happened all over the world, and some in populations that never had clinical poliomyelitis until after the injection started. We still see this. It's still going on in India and Pakistan and places where the oral polio vaccines are being used, and there are lots of intramuscular injections. I want to talk about tonsillectomies, which is another form of provocation that could induce another form of provocation polio. Tonsils serve as gatekeepers of lung and intestinal immunity, and this is just more evidence that God knew what he was doing here when you look at this, is that this is protection for breathing and swallowing, and there's a ring of lymphoid tissue in the throat. The top one here is the adenoid. Over on the side, we have tubal tonsils that protect the eustachian tubes. On the side, we have the palatine tonsils, which are the ones that you can see most easily when you look in this throat. Whoop. And on the bottom, we have a lingual tonsil, which you can see better over on the sagittal section. Oh, which button do I want? There we go. I want to go back that way. Well, from the early 1900s right through the era of the polio epidemics, tonsillectomies became the #1 bread and butter operation performed on children. Yeah, take a deep breath. By the 1950s, up to 85% of healthy, wealthy children had had the procedure. And then the procedure declined in the years that polio declined. Well, healthy tonsils were removed for a variety of financially efficient but scientifically unsound reasons. For polio virus to cause damage, it requires access to the inside of the body, which can happen through peripheral nerve damage, like we talked about with provocation from needles. Well, peripheral nerve damage is something that tonsillectomy provides in abundance. And it gives toxins and viruses direct path to the brainstem and the rest of the body, while hampering the ability of the person to entrap polio viruses in the throat and the intestinal lymphatic zones the way they're supposed to. Poliomyelitis was approximately 2 times more prevalent in tonsillectomized than non-tonsillectomized people. And during the 1930s and 1950s, bulbar poliomyelitis, bulbar poliomyelitis is the one that causes brainstem problems and lack of, and respiratory death. Bulbar poliomyelitis cases in tonsillectomized 1 to 10-year-olds was 6-fold higher than non-bulbar polio. Bulbar polio was 16 times as great in tonsillectomized children than it was in the general population. The recommendation at the time was to try not to do tonsillectomies during polio season. Tonsil removal also eliminates local immune globulin, meaning right in the throat, production, and prevents normal antigen processing by the body. That's the first thing that throat, those lymph glands are the first thing that antigens and viruses and toxins are supposed to hit that prevents the rest of the body from becoming sick. Well, in 1971, Dr. Ogre reported in the New England Journal of Medicine that post-operatively, local polio antibody titers decreased 6 to 8-fold. The local response to the vaccine was also significantly blunted in the tonsillectomized, meaning that if you had a tonsillectomy and then you got a vaccine, you couldn't respond to it in your throat. You couldn't develop any immune globulin in your throat. There was another paper by Southcott in 1953 that suggested that removal of tonsils doesn't just increase the risk of polio for a short time, but 5 to 10 years. There were other papers that suggested it was much longer than that. After tonsillectomies, we come to white sugar. And there are 2 articles that I really recommend. I think there's a bibliography that you're all going to have that I listed out all these articles that I'm talking about, plus more articles. So everything I'm saying is backed up by literature that I can give you. Well, Van Meer in 1992 published a report that well-nourished victims of polio are those whose diets were rich in sugar. And the change from sporadic to epidemic polio globally coincided with local increases in the consumption of refined sugar. Chemicals, disinfectants, bleaches, and quicklime were all used in the refining process, which seems, according to Van Meer, was probably one of the reasons. Well, Dr. Benjamin Sandler wrote a little book. It's 50-some-odd pages long, and this book is also PDF'd on the internet, and you can read it. I think Whale 2 has a copy of it, too. But Dr. Sandler organized an experiment in sugar consumption starting in 1948 in North Carolina. In 1948, North Carolina had the 2nd highest rate of poliomyelitis. So he went on radio and television and broadcast, and through newspapers, broadcast his theory that decreasing consumption of sugar would decrease poliomyelitis. And people were so frightened that they actually listened to him. He was surprised that people listened to him, but they did. In 1949, North Carolina saw a 90% drop in poliomyelitis cases. They went from 66.3 per 100,000 in 1948 to 6.3 in 1949. Details can be read about this in his book. His theory was basically that the postprandial hypoglycemia that happens leads cells to be susceptible to the virus. Which way do I want to go now? I already did? Okay. I love this slide. This was a Time magazine ad from 1947. Yeah, just take that in for a minute while I read to you. DDT was first synthesized in 1874, but its insecticidal properties weren't discovered until 1939. And it was used with great success in the second half of the World War II to control malaria and typhus among civilians and troops. After the war, DDT was made available for use in agricultural insecticide and for common household use. In 1962, Silent Spring was written by American biologist Rachel Carson, and this began the era of awareness of DDT's many toxicities, at least in the animal kingdom. Well, according to this, DDT could be put on your produce, it could be put on the meat, it could be put near the baby, you could put it on anything you picked out in the field, the cattle. It was good for me. I'm thinking there was probably a song that went with that, but I don't know what it was. Can you hear the jingle now? If DDT was thought to be good for me, What doctor, what public health agency would list it as a cause for the paralysis that was ripping through the country in the 1950s? Well, there were only a few doctors at the time who were publishing to this effect, but they were ignored, like I said, and they were called quacks. This is a graph that depicts the parallel between polio epidemics in the USA and tonnage of DDT and pesticide production in the USA between 1940 and 1970. What we see is the blue line here is polio. It's magnified by 7.7, but that's basically the pattern. Look at the pattern here. And then the dotted line is DDT and other pesticide production by the ton. Polio appeared to be a vicious entity from the late 1800s until DDT was coincidentally phased out of the agricultural industries in the USA. But that didn't happen until after a vaccine for polio was well accepted as a savior for humanity in 1954. The United States was considered free of wild polio as of 1979. Insects were believed to spread polio outdoors and in the home. In response to this belief, fearful parents put DDT all through the house. They put it on drawers, they sprinkled it on windowsills, lunch boxes, directly on sandwiches, in water to rinse clothes, bedding, and mattresses, and painted it on the walls of children's rooms. You could even buy DDT-impregnated wallpaper if you wanted to. It's no wonder the well-to-do had such a high problem with polio, is it? Can we play this video now? These are children walking to school in the morning, being sprayed by DDT. Walking in the fumes at lunch, they're being fumigated while they're eating, DDT. While swimming in the summertime, guess what? DDT, it's good for me, Dive under it. Kids thought it was good for them. They wanted it. DDT was everywhere. It was in all kinds of household products that you could buy just about anywhere. This was a Canadian documentary. Thank you. I feel like I'm going to knock something over back here with all my pacing. Oh, my turn. This was just another picture that was in National Geographic magazine, a DDT truck going up the beach to spray people. In 1951, Albert Sabin noticed that the American military in the Philippines had astonishingly high rates of polio, approximately 1 in 79 recruits. Yet he was utterly mystified as to why that would be. And he was even more mystified why the Filipino people considered polio the white man's disease at that time. He also noted similar coincidences in China and Japan. This slide is a World War II Army poster from the collection of the National Museum of Health and Medicine at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And this tells you how to delouse an incoming recruit with DDT. What you do is you loosen all their clothes up and you get the DDT sprayer and you go down the neck, up the sleeves, down the pants, up the pants. You sit them down, you fumigate their head thoroughly, you flip their hat over and you spray it into their hat. Villages near military bases were not affected, even though in many cases local people were intermixing with the soldiers and their families. It's not very mysterious, is it? Well, DDT, refined sugar, flour, tobacco, and vaccines were all part of not only the American way of life, but the soldiers' way of life. And we know that military recruits are heavily vaccinated, often with experimental vaccines. DDT can be a sole cause of poliomyelitis, or it can be an additive factor. DDT is known to induce symptoms that can be indistinguishable from poliomyelitis, even in the absence of a virus. If there's one of my references that you read, please read this one. This is a fascinating paper. The other thing is DDT toxicity can give anterior horn and the spinal cord changes, just like polio. It can cause respiratory failure, just like polio. It causes spasm and flaccid paralysis, just like polio. Aside from that, DDT enhances the release and intracellular multiplication of polioviruses, as we see here in this paper written by Janice Gabliks in 1967. And what she did is she looked at various insecticides and measured the amount of polio multiplication and release from different cells after they were treated with different insecticides. And she saw that the yield per cell of polio virus increased 37% and 90% in the presence of DDT, depending on, trying to find my pointer here. Does anybody else see my pointer? Oh, wow, it's hiding there. It's afraid of DDT. Okay. So here we have the control, and then here we have 20 micrograms per ml, and here we have 40 micrograms per ml incubation with DDT, and the yield per cell of poliovirus nearly doubles with the 40 micrograms. There were other pesticides. One was called kelthane, and that induced a 4 times increase in poliovirus production. And there was another one called carathane, which induced an 18 times increase in polio production. And this is in cells. This isn't in people. This is in petri dishes. Well, what's the reason for this? I don't know for sure, but I think it's probably because DDT has a direct toxic effect upon mucosal and gut flora, and that gave polio an adaptive advantage in the digestive tract. Also, perhaps because DDT greatly depletes body stores of vitamin C, which is needed not only to process toxins, but also viruses. This is a description of DDT poisoning. Tell me if you think this sounds very different from poliomyelitis. Acute gastroenteritis with nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea, usually associated with extreme tenesmus, runny nose, cough, and persistent sore throat, followed by persistent or recurrent feeling of constriction or lump in the throat. Now, when people present to the hospital with constriction or lump in the throat or any throat problems, they thought they were developing bulbar poliomyelitis. Occasionally, the sensation of constriction extends substernally to the back and may be associated with severe pain in either arm. Arm pain was a symptom of polio. Pain in the joints, generalized muscle weakness, which was another symptom of polio. Apprehension and exhausting fatigue are usual. The latter are often so severe in the acute stage as to be described by some patients as paralysis. How could doctors possibly have distinguished a case that looked like this from polio? They didn't. It would have been called polio and it would have been treated as such, probably with a crippling outcome.